according to, other family members, got into a reverse type of abuse. His wife was the abuser and abused him and abused their children until he snapped and he killed her one day. He just shot her and he called the police and said, I killed her, and sat there and waited for them. Podcast Through the Eyes of Survivors. I'm Tara Woodlee, president of Break the Silence Against Domestic Violence. And today I'm here with our chairwoman, Midori Davidson. And we're going to talk today about the effects of molestation and generational abuse. I know myself, my family has a long-standing history of that, and Midori as well. So we want to open up that conversation and see if we can help others understand how this happens through families. So, Midori, I know you have a very interesting story to tell about that within your family, what happened. So, where do you want to start?
Gosh, where do I begin? I began exploring this honestly when I was diagnosed with having complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And for those who don't understand what that means when with PTSD, it is a singular event that happened that caused trauma to arise within your life. And it was that one singular event that just, for lack of a better term, set it off for you, right? With complex post-traumatic stress disorder, it's a series of events. Like the trauma never stopped. And in analyzing my life, my trauma began at 4 and it's still ongoing because the biggest topping here is my mother's disappearance and the fact that it was never resolved. She is still a Jane Doe in the system, if she's even in the system, because every time I look on legal websites, government websites, to look for any information of her, it is impossible to find. So that is what complex post-traumatic stress disorder in a nutshell is. And with molestation, while it happened to me at the age of 4, and it was through my perpetrator was my babysitter's 13-year-old brother. Okay. So in learning about how that affected me in terms of, having panic attacks in certain dark areas, or why I used to shut down when I was around a group of men at times, outside of my family. I learned about how this could be generational, and I wanted to explore that subject matter. And ironically enough, when I was 19, I was assaulted by a family member, and learning about and taking that journey to heal, because I went through a very dark period of alcoholism and other crazy behavior that I didn't even know that I could pursue. But in terms of going through that journey towards healing, I learned that my perpetrator was abused by my grandmother. And he was 9 years old.
Wow, that is so. That is not even. I don't know how you even get your brain around that.
I couldn't. I remember the conversation we had like it was yesterday, and I tell you, when I say we both cried, it was like we both cried a river, because I knew he was holding on to that for years. And when I look back in retrospect, the behavior that he exemplified showed, because there was tons of drug use, thievery. He was pimping out women, very, very dark behavior, and everybody in the family was like, this MF, This motherfucker stole my rug. He owes me $300. My goddamn TV was stolen the other day. That was a brand new color TV set. Where the fuck is my TV?
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, this mirrors almost exactly what I was doing when this happened to me. So we had the longest conversation about it. And not only was it healing for the both of us, but it was very freeing for me because he took ownership.
Right.
Where a lot of perpetrators do not, because when I was molested at 4, my perpetrator was 13. When my mother tried to attack him, the police was called on her and nothing was done with him, except they knew something else was going on because of the way I was sitting in the car with the other officer. And
Right.
it took a trained older officer to know the difference. Like, hey, leave mom alone. There's something else going on here. We need to have a conversation instead.
Yeah.
Okay. So that is where, and our legal system, our officers who work for the legal system, they really need to understand not just the act of molestation, but they need to understand the behavior.
Right.
They need to see what it looks like before you make judgment calls, and it's a little better today, but a lot of work needs to be done on that. And like I say, when I learned that it happened to my abuser at the age of 9, my stomach actually just cramped up.
Yeah, it literally makes you sick, because
It does. It does make you sick, for real.
I know in my family, we had that same kind of catalyst, right? The catalyst in my family was my daughter's death. The going through her abuse and her stalking and being hunted down and murdered is what started the conversation as to everything that built up to that before. And before that, nobody talked in my family. So my mother started opening up about her molestation at the hands of a great grandfather. And you look back and then you find out, as everybody starts opening up and talking, he molested his daughters. He molested, my grandmother, my mother, her cousins. And the effects it had led to 100 years later, my daughter being murdered because of what we passed down generationally from this one man.
Oh, yeah, because I totally get what you're saying, because when it was brought up what happened to me about my assault, my grandmother called me everything but a child of God. I mean, I was all kinds of sluts. Did I wear a tight dress? Was I wearing mini skirts that I had no business wearing? Knowing good and well that was just not my style at all. And I was all kinds of lying bitches, and you're just like your mother. And I'm like, what happened to my mother? Right? So then I learned with my mother's first marriage, she was beaten. Her first husband abused her, and it caused her to miscarry. She was pregnant by this man. Then I learned that my grandmother was beaten by her boyfriend in front of the children. So my mother and my uncles also witnessed this, on top of the family secret of what happened to my abuser when he was 9. So then I go back even further, and all of this is circumventing around my mother. I learned that my mother's paternal grandmother, my great grandmother Fanny, she was murdered.
Oh, yeah.
She was murdered. She was strangled to death. So I'm like, wow. So here we are.
Yeah. That cycle, because
That
even like I was saying, that great grandfather of mine, he had like 8 children, and all the girls he molested and the boys he abused. And I know one of the sons actually, according to other family members, got into a reverse type of abuse. His wife was the abuser and abused him and abused their children until he snapped and he killed her one day. He just shot her and he called the police and said, I killed her, and sat there and waited for them. And they put him in a mental hospital back in the 60s because of it when it happened. And so we had the same thing in our family, that whole thing just catalyzed into, murder in several different ways, in the family. It's it's definitely a vengeful cycle,
It is. And, it makes me, I know within the African American community, when we look at dysfunctional behavior like that, as we can always trace that back to slavery, because when plantation owners needed more cattle or more property to make money, they would force inbreeding.
Mm-hmm.
There are documents or stories where they would actually sit and watch to make sure they're doing their job, which is disgusting, absolutely disgusting. So it's so vile that it is a secret.
Mm-hmm.
Vile because you can't wrap your head around that kind of misogynistic behavior. You just can't. You can't. And then when it comes out generations later, everybody is like, where is this coming from? There's nobody about it.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you think about the aftermath, the depression, the anxiety, the body shaming, because I can remember being in high school and seeing my friends wear these cute little short mini dresses. My dresses were always at my kneecap. Anything about that I would not wear.
Right.
I was that ashamed. And it takes away from your youth. It takes away from the fun of exploring femininity,
Right.
It takes away from even the curiosity of wanting to see what all you can be as a woman. It totally takes away that momentum. And it breaks my heart when I hear other women say the same thing. I'm ashamed of my body. That's why I get body art. I'm ashamed of my body. That's why I wear leggings underneath stuff. I'm ashamed of my body, which is why I gained weight. And there was a period where I did. I thought by gaining weight, I wouldn't be attractive. So I would be left alone.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a theory that went wrong. It went all the way left. And today I'm dealing with health issues because of that choice.
Right.
So it's self-destructive.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. I made up my mind as a teenager through the experiences I had. And like you were saying, it was constant trauma, and all the way through. And one of the things I did not experience was the shame with my body. That's something I made up in my mind. I kind of watched my grandmother go through a lot of that. And until the day she died, she was always dieting, yo-yoing, trying to make herself look like something to please other people and what she felt like society thought she should look like. And I kind of made up my mind that wasn't for me. I was going to be comfortable with who I was. And I still live by that today, but I had the other effects of it because there was a whole lot of spiritual dynamics for me with my abuse. So having to come to terms with a lot of how sinful was I. And the whole family had a dynamic of that through this generational abuse, carrying that weight of your sin, something you did created all this, caused all this.
Exactly.
Yeah, and how do you put that on children?
That part.
Yeah,
That
it's
part.
insidious,
It
and
is.
and it still happens today. You
Oh
know.
yeah. Oh yeah. Every time, I mean, like the school shooting in Nashville, that
Hmm.
I could just puke. Like, why, and I posted this question on one of my uncle's chats. I said, why is it that children are often the target of such mental madness? Mental
Yeah.
madness. I mean, the abuse, the violence, the sexual abuse, children are targeted. Like there's this awesome documentary on Netflix called The Girl in the Picture.
Hmm.
And this girl was literally kidnapped by her mother's boyfriend when she was like 2 years old. And everywhere they went, he changed names so that nobody could find them. This baby was abused since she was 2 years old until she got killed when she was 20.
Oh Lord.
It was so, Tara, by the time it got to the ending, my face was swollen. I was crying so hard because the mother, her biological mother had no idea where she was. But when they interviewed her, it was like, well, I did try to find her. It was like this nonchalant response to an ongoing mystery. Like, how could you be so nonchalant? And the biological father, and this is how crazy this was. How they learned who her biological parents was when this girl was by like 16 or so, she got pregnant because the man who kidnapped her also used her for prostitution to make money when they didn't have any money to live off of. He sold her. So she got pregnant by one of her Johns. And that baby was put up for adoption. She had the wherewithal to say, let someone adopt this child. So when the child was adopted, and this girl who was in the picture who had like a gazillion names, they located her daughter, talked to the adoptive parents, and they were like, look, we're trying to put a correct headstone on for this woman because the strippers wanted to buy her a headstone. This is how wild this was. When
Oh
she
my
died, yes,
gosh.
when she died, she was a stripper in Phoenix, right?
Oh
the,
my.
the strippers and the bar owner were like, well, we need to put a funeral service together for her. So all the strippers put in their earnings, what they made, and they were like, well, hell, we may not have enough to do a funeral service, but let's at least give our girl Tanya a headstone. Let's give her a proper burial because she was killed on the highway. A truck hit her, right?
Oh.
And so they go to get the headstone and they look up her name because they were trying to make sure they were spelling it right. Come to find out, the name belonged to somebody else who was dead.
Oh my
So
God.
then that's when the FBI came in and was like, okay, this man has been using dead people's names for years. And
Oh.
then when the girl was a teenager, he got a marriage certificate saying that they were husband and wife. That way it threw off the police and the FBI even more. But this man was a serial killer. He had a record of child abuse, sexual abuse. And the reason why the biological mother got with him is because the girl's biological father was drafted to the Vietnam War. When he came back, of course, he wasn't mentally together. So he had the common sense to say, look, I'm not even mentally stable to take care of myself. I can't even think about marriage and getting an apartment. My mind ain't there. So he wasn't supportive of the biological mother and the children. He couldn't support them mentally. So she got with this guy. He comes into the church where she was working because he claimed to be lost. And then he sweet talks her. Next thing you know, they're living in a trailer park and she wants to marry this guy. And when they get married, he decided to kidnap the oldest girl, which was the girl in the picture. And the other two girls, her sisters, were left behind. So they found all this out by pulling out a piece of hair from the daughter's brush.
Oh, man. You know what? I'm going to let you finish the story in a second here. I think this is a good time to let us take a break real quick and some information about the organization real quick and be right back and finish the story with Midori here.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Through the Eyes of Survivors. You will see us in the next episode, and thank you.
All right, we're back, and I'm here with Midori Davidson, the chairwoman of Break the Silence Against Domestic Violence. And finish your story, Midori, because that was crazy.
It was. This documentary is still on Netflix, and it's just wild. Like, they took the hair from the daughter, and they ran an analysis test, and that's how they were able to trace the biology of the stripper, quote unquote, Tanya. And come to find out, her name was like Suzanne, or it was something way off kilter. And that's how the family and even the biological father came to learn about what happened to her. Because when she was kidnapped, he wasn't in contact with the mother at all. So the daughter was able to piece everything together for them just by the strand of her hair. So when the FBI contacted all the family members, the nieces, nephews, the daughter, and then there was a boy that she had. His name was Michael. Michael was by another John. Michael, she was actually trying to keep, but the kidnapper, or the one who played her daddy, quote unquote, decided, no, she can't keep this baby because he's in my way. So he actually went up to the school, held a gun up to the teacher and the principal, took him out of the school and killed the boy. He was 4 years old.
Oh, my.
Girl, when I say by the time I was done, I was a wreck.
I would be too.
I was a freaking wreck. I was like this, and you can't make this stuff up. Like, this is a real life story.
It's some real shit, and people don't understand. Like, sometimes people think, oh, this is so far-fetched. There's just no way, until you really start putting the pieces together.
Exactly.
Like, the death of my daughter seems so far-fetched. It seems like a Lifetime movie, and then you add everything else in that happened for our family for generations. You're like, damn, that is some bullshit.
Yeah,
and it's real. It's not a movie.
It's not a movie. Serious. It's not made up. Because even when I learned about my great-grandmother, I was like, why was she strangled to death? Because I met my great-grandfather. We used to have ice cream together. So this was the same man who I used to sit in front of his cafe with his wife, who I used to call Miss Estelle. We would sit up and have hamburgers and hot dogs and ice cream together. This man strangled my great-grandmother? Why? Whatever for?
Well, and it was the same thing with my Uncle Don. Like I told you, that uncle who killed. Yeah. I met him after, in the 70s and 80s. He had come out of the mental hospital, and they had given him electric shock treatments, and he was in there for 10 years. And this man literally would pick up little bugs out of his apartment and set them free. He didn't have the heart to kill them. And I'm going, you're telling me he killed his wife? There is no way, my Uncle Don. What in the world are you talking about?
Exactly. When my cousin told me that about my great-grandmother Fanny, I was like, wow, Daddy Sam did this? This man, we would hang out together. Like, he was like the coolest great-grandfather I ever met. And he murdered my great-grandmother? I'm really not understanding. But it also made sense as to why my grandfather, my biological grandfather, who ironically, I lost to murder when I was 10 years old, and he was buried on my mother's birthday. And he was such a stern man. I mean, he was a cool guy, but he was very stern. He never talked about his father at all.
Mm-hmm.
I just remember seeing a picture of him, but he never discussed his father. He always talked about his mother.
Mm-hmm.
Always. So even to this day, I am still researching the Batty side of my family. Like, we actually have a Facebook page. My cousin in Texas started this page back in 2014. It was like 30 people at the time. We're at 400 now.
Right.
Because we're all ancestors of a Haitian slave whose name was spelled wrong. So that part we know. So we know we're related. We just don't know how. And again, it goes back to the crazy behaviors of violence, sexual misconduct. And, unfortunately, during slavery, if you weren't very educated, you didn't keep proper records. So the record keeping for African Americans in this country at large was really null and void because nobody cared. So we're still having to go back and dig and compare these people. Like, who are the names to who? But it just blows me away every time when I look at that. When I saw that documentary, I'm like, wow, this poor child was kidnapped. Nobody knew where she was, and her life on a daily basis was at the hands of a man who sexually abused her.
Mm-hmm.
She was 2 years old.
Mm.
God.
That's it. Mm-mm.
And it's so, and like I say, people say, oh, that stuff doesn't happen. Yes, it does.
Every family.
Yes.
People just got good at hiding it. It's one of those things, like I told my husband, I'm not trying to diss on his family or anything, but his family has been one of those that through the years have been like, the attitude is kind of like, not my family. This kind of stuff doesn't happen in our family, right? But they gave Jim a very old family Bible that goes back, with a family history in the front, right? Birth records, death records, marriage records. And it goes back maybe 150, 170 years. Oh, yeah, their family too. You could see it all right in there. Somebody got married and then they had a child 6 months later. Yeah, it happened in your family too,
Absolutely.
kind of thing.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I can say to that is that where slavery and capitalism intersect, because it was capitalism, the patriarchy, and the control that men must have is the origin of all of the dysfunction that we generations later are still struggling with.
Well, you got a good point in that, because when you think about it, even in my family history, you're talking 100 years ago, you're talking turn of the century when women were trying to get the right to vote and everything. And look at a lot of what he did, how it controlled the whole family, from children to wife to everything. So that need to control every aspect of it, dominate it, tear it apart. Wreck it. And how the family, that's the thing I have never understood in all of this. How in the world did he go clear to great grandchildren and nobody stopped that motherfucker?
Right. That's what blows me away. Is like, my grandmother was strangled to death, and you're in a town called Yazoo City, Mississippi, which is the size of your pinky. Why didn't anybody intervene?
Why not? I don't get that. What I love my grandmother to death. She's one of the people that, she helped raise me and everything. And I still in my head are like, he molested you. And yet you let him lay down with your children at naps. What did you think was happening? And why didn't you stop that? Right.
because it doesn't go away magically. You just can't wave a wand or wish it away. It doesn't go away.
Right.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Yeah, I encourage people to take a look at that documentary. And if you've eaten, let the food settle before you watch that documentary on Netflix called The Girl in the Picture. It will blow your wig off. It really will.
Oh, absolutely.
That hurt me so bad. I was like, wow. That's just as crazy as the documentary they also put on Netflix called Our Father. This gynecologist, he impregnates his own patients and they didn't know.
I know. That case, when you see stuff like that, you're like, no way. You can't even trust your doctor.
Town. Yeah, they're all in the same town. These women pick samples from his catalog, if you will, because he actually had male medical interns donate samples. Right. So these women would go through the catalog and pick their sample. And one woman brought her own husband's sample. So for years, he thought the child was his until she decided when she was older, I don't look like my father. I need to do some research because I don't look the same as everybody in my family. And when she got on 23andMe and you find that you have like 30 brothers and sisters in the first hit.
Oh, no. I can't even. I've got mine are all half siblings, and so I have 7 of them. I can't imagine if I found out I had like 30 something on that.
I was like, no way. And it was insane. They even asked him, like, why did you do this to our mothers? Why?
Now, can you imagine how violated you would feel years later?
Yeah, that's rape. That is rape. They did not give this man permission to do that. And the judge didn't classify it as rape. So now you have these children having to accept, they are forced to accept that they have a new identity through this doctor. Everything that they thought they knew was a lie.
Right.
And he took advantage of these women because they couldn't get pregnant naturally, or the men could not impregnate them naturally, So they were taken advantage of. And this is the thanks you get for trusting somebody, a medical expert. And now this child growing up is now understanding who I thought I was. I'm not. That messes with you right here.
Again, it will mess with generations.
Yes. How do you explain that to your child?
And they explain it to their children, and your grandpa just put his sperm into your grandma, and he was her doctor.
And they were even saying how he would jack off in the office, and I'm like,
oh my God.
You mean to tell me you walk by his office and you don't hear anything weird? Like, how can you ignore that? How do you let that go? That's crazy to me.
Oh, it's crazy as hell.
It is. It is. I was so, the entire time I was watching it, my mouth was like, this is sick. And these children were forced to accept something that they had no idea. They had no idea. And all these parents wanted to do was have a family. They wanted to be as normal about it as possible. And then when the men find out that it's not theirs.
I know. But, as we're talking about this, I'm sitting here thinking, even with us, we're like, that's crazy. But when we tell our stories, we have people react the same way to us.
Hey,
Like, that's
exactly.
crazy. And
Like, get the hell out of here, for real?
yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow. Oh, wow. I mean, and it's just, that's why for me, when I look at, everyone says, oh, we need to make sure that the children are okay. We need to work with the children to protect and to save them. And while I say that is accurate, I will go on to say that it's the adults that need the help. People want to look at the adults as, oh, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. What happened. There's no need to have an adult revisit it. Let's focus on the child because that child is our future. But the adult is our present. And if that adult is in that child's life, let's work with the adult to see how we can make the child's present navigate to where they can have a future. If we're not working with the adults, this is what's happening. You see these school shootings.
Mm-hmm.
You should not be paranoid about sending your child to get to school to get an education.
No. And I'll add to that. You've got to revisit the past.
Yes,
because here we are, we're talking about that generational. If you're not talking about that generational past, you are doomed to failure. The same mistakes will happen over and over and over again.
Oh, yeah.
It's got to be a whole holistic way of looking at it for this to stop and to heal. Otherwise, we're failing our children.
We are. We're failing our children, and ultimately we're failing ourselves because we're not helping ourselves to not only mature, but to be productive.
Mm-hmm.
Part of being a parent is to be productive. You can't take care of your child if you are not taking care of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So then there comes these moments of neglect. And,
right.
And I can speak from experience in the fact that my mother suffered from manic depression. Had there been enough resources when I was growing up for her to get the help that she needed, perhaps she would be here today.
Right.
And those are the kinds of things that I connect the dots to. And, seeing that documentary, I'm like, these children of this gynecologist now have to literally go to therapy to rethink their whole way of life. And these people have children that they have to explain this to.
Mm-hmm.
And then the gynecologist didn't want them to go public because he didn't want his wife to know. He had children by his wife.
Yeah.
Really? You impregnate half a town and you don't want nobody to know? Are you serious? Children, the nieces and nephews of these children that he procreated, they're going to school together. They play softball together.
Well, yeah, see, and what would have happened if this wouldn't come out? There's possible marriages that could have happened with
and the
family members.
Yes. And that was one of the things one of the brothers was saying. He was like, just imagine if she hadn't found me, and just imagine if I met her on the street and I thought she was cute, I would be dating my sister. And he said, the thought of that just makes me sick.
Right.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. The consequences are so far reaching.
The consequences can be very grave if you do not deal with the inner turmoil of your past. The reason why you're uncomfortable is there's unresolved issues.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, Midori, I think this is a good time to take another break real quick and let people find out more about Break the Silence and how they might be able to help the organization bring awareness about these kind of issues.
Thank you.
All right, we're back. Midori, boy, this has been I've liked this conversation a lot out of all our other podcasts because you and I talk like this all the time and on a daily basis and for years now. And, I want to go back to talking more about your mom and, and the things that kind of happened with your mom. Do you think your mom was a part of that cycle of definitely with the molestation? And how do you think that affected you, kind of your relationship with her?
I think she was. And the reason why I say that is because of when it happened to me, the amount of guilt that she took on, it was so paramount for her.
Right.
She went into a deeper depression for a minute. I saw her self-medicate more. And I distinctly remember at the time, and this was in the mid 70s. So we're talking about 75, 76. Right. There was a book that came out by these two feminist activists, and one of them was a gynecologist. They did a book called Our Bodies, Ourselves, and that book is still in circulation today. Right. And I'm 4 years old reading this encyclopedia with her because back then it was like this thick hardback book. Mm-hmm. And my mother would always ask, "What are you feeling? How are you feeling? Let's talk about it." And I'm 4 years old. I'm like, well, I'm fine. I just want to watch Fat Albert.
Yeah.
I had my schedule. I had the Flintstones, Scooby-Doo, Fat Albert, and Soul Train in that order.
I feel I had that same thing.
Yeah,
so Saturday morning program,
give me my bowl of cereal and let me do my routine here. And how am I feeling? I didn't understand what she wanted me to explore until I got older. And by then, we had moved to Boston, and this women's organization did their very first Take Back the Night march to Kenmore Park. And my mother was adamant about us being in that march. And it was pouring down rain. It was a monsoon. It was thunderstorms. And we're walking in the rain. And I kept looking at her like, why are you hell-bent on being in this march? And it wasn't until we reached our destination, she looked down at me and she was like, "You have a voice. Mm-hmm. This is the place where I want you to start learning how to use it and how to explore. You can't be quiet about what happened to you." And I heard her say, "I was forced to be silent, but you're not going to be. I want you to feel free to open up and speak out and speak up. And I brought you here to learn how to do that." And that's when it became clear to me, this was way more personal for her than I knew.
Right. Absolutely. See, I personally, my mother was so hypervigilant so that nothing ever happened to me as far as molestation, but the ramifications of her molestation as far as relationship between her and I was she was very cold, and she still is very cold and reserved in some ways. She has trouble saying "I love you." She detaches herself from people. And it was very hard to have a mother that you didn't understand that growing up. And she was self-medicating, alcohol and Valium, and in the 70s again.
Oh, yeah. My mother had a blue pipe with marijuana in it, and it even had her initial P on it. So, and it looked like a toy. So I thought I could use it with one of my teddy bears, and she blew up. She was like, "Give me that." And I'm like, "This is not plastic." She's like, "No."
Oh my gosh.
And me, oops, I know. thought it was a toy.
Right.
But you say your mom was cold and distant. That was my maternal grandmother. My maternal grandmother was just like that. And the weird thing is that after my assault with my family member, I was in my 30s and she called me out of the blue and she said, I just want to apologize. And that's how she said it. And I said, apologize for what? She said, I should have been more supportive when your cousin told me what happened. And I wasn't. That happened to me too. And it was by a family member. And she admitted that she was raped by a family member, but she would not tell me who it was. She would not go into detail, but her whole conversation with me was cold and stoic. She was like, that happened to me too. So I just want to apologize for not being supportive.
Right.
But I don't recall her saying, I love you either, even as a child.
My mother very rarely, even still now, she has a very hard time with that. But our reconciliation came after Ashley was murdered. So that's when she apologized. And she was actually one of the few people who were there with me through the whole court case, death penalty, everything. She was there every time and turned into the mother that I always wanted. But it took that to be the catalyst for it. But even now, she's still she's freer with her hugs and things like that. But she still has a very hard time being able to express the words, I love you.
Yeah. That was my grandmother. She loved to hug. She loved to bake. When we were growing up, when we were kids, she was actually a very cool grandmother because she was a young grandmother. She was 42 when I was born. So when I was 5, 6 years old, going fishing with her, riding around in her Charlie's Angels Mustang, and I got to stand up in the sunroof and pretend that I was Miss America and wave at everybody. And she would honk the horn like, honk, honk, wave me, Dory, it's your cue. She was that kind of grandmother, but I never remembered her saying, I love you. She would always say, give grandma a kiss.
Right.
Like she made you express it to her.
Right.
Yeah. She made you express it to her, even in her cards that she would send. Love GM. Not love grandma, but love Grams or GM, because she was a young grandmother. So for her, it's like I'm too young to get into all that grandma stuff, but I know I have grandchildren, so I'll acknowledge them. You know what I'm saying?
Because my grandmother was a young grandmother too. Because my mom was 16 when she got pregnant with me, and my grandma was 16 when she got pregnant with her. So my grandmother was in her 30s when I came along, but my grandmother was similar. She wasn't as stoic, but she was very controlling of everybody. And that's where her trauma went out.
Yeah.
When you put the pieces together of what happened to all our women in the family, she found a way to control the trauma by controlling every aspect of everything in her life, including everyone around her. And boy, if you didn't do it,
grandmother, very controlling, super controlling. And when my uncle passed away, my cousins and I were riding with her because we were going to the funeral home to look at some final details. And she was talking about her children, but it was like this negative light. And so I finally had to ask, did you love any of your children? I mean, were there any positive traits about your children that you could actually speak on? Because we always heard negative.
Right.
And she got real quiet. And she said, well, yeah, I guess so. I said, you guess? You gave birth to them. Wasn't the labor worth it? I mean, there had to have been something good out of all that work.
Right.
And she was like, really, Midori, is that how you have to put it? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't understand the behavior.
Mm-hmm.
But I did not realize that the control came from the cognitive dissonance of her relationship with her mother. They did
Right.
not get along.
Mm-hmm.
She was definitely a daddy's girl. And she did not get along with her mother at all. Even when my mother was born, her mother and she fought over who was going to raise my mother. And my great grandmother kept my mother for the first 10 years. She did not want my mother to go to California with her. And it's an interesting family pattern because that happened with me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is, because we have that same family pattern. My grandmother helped to raise me so my mother could go back to school.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
And then they moved down here from Ohio to Texas when I was 4. And my grandmother drugged all of us, all the kids, including my mom and me, because she wasn't going without me. And so most of my life, she helped take care of me to a point of I felt more like she was my mother than my mother was.
Yep, absolutely. Same here. And it was so interesting that when I was dealing with issues of my maternal grandmother's death, the state guardian was like, okay, I get it. She raised you, but you're her granddaughter. So legally, we can't tell you certain things, but because you're representing your mother in her absence and she did raise you, here's what we are able to do. It was very confusing for them. Because it was like, yeah, she raised you, but you're her granddaughter. You're not her daughter, and your mom is not here. So I get that you're in this double stance of representation. So here's how we could work with you. It was trying. It was very trying. But again, those are the kinds of things that arise out of dysfunction.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
These are the kinds of things that happen. And that's why if I had to say anything about dealing with generational trauma, especially when it's sexual abuse, the first inclination of a red flag, deal with it.
Absolutely.
Deal with it. Don't ignore your instincts. Don't ignore your gut. Because there's a reason why it's coming up. Those moments of discomfort is information.
Absolutely. Well, it's better to be wrong in these cases than to ignore it and it turns out to be something way more usually than what you are even catching. Because if you're catching these little pieces of it, it's like the tip of the iceberg in families. It really is. It goes a whole lot deeper, especially when you have it going with children on children within families. Because if there's an older child in the family that's going down and affecting or molesting younger children, then there's usually there's another layer and another layer, and you peel it back and you find out things that should have been dealt with a long time ago.
A long time ago, that part. Absolutely. Absolutely. And, there's no shame in unearthing these things because at the end of the day, this is a part of you. And that was one of the things that I struggled with wholeheartedly when I was sexually assaulted by my family member. I struggled with the fact that I had to accept it. I mean, I would take hot showers until I scalded my skin. The drinking to try to forget the behavior, all the just crazy behavior that I was doing. I mean, I would go to class drunk.
Well, and even within the families, like I
Yeah.
remember being at a speaking engagement after Ashley died, talking about her story. And one of Josh's cousins, a female cousin, attended and came up to me and went, I'm one of Josh's cousins. And I thought, oh gosh, we're going to have a throwdown right here, right? His
Right.
family is going to. And she was like, I want to thank you for speaking out because Josh raped me when I was 15 and the family ignored it.
No.
And so if if that family wouldn't have ignored it, maybe my daughter would be here.
Thank you. Thank you.
So
Thank
it
you.
spills out further than what you even know within your families.
Jesus
So,
Christ.
mhm.
That just,
Right.
it's how can you ignore that?
I don't know.
Oh,
Well, they wanted to apply everything to that he was mentally ill. Well, then get him some help for his
get him
mental
some
illness.
help. Yeah. Don't just make the excuse.
Mhm.
Oh, shit. That's crazy.
Yeah. And here was this poor young woman with all the weight of the world on her, partially blaming herself for the death of my daughter
Oh,
because
my
nothing could
gosh.
be done. And if
Oh,
something
my
had been
gosh.
done, that's
Yeah.
not fair.
It's not.
No.
It's not. And that's the other piece of it when you're a child having to deal with circumstances that were before you, but yet you're burnt and hurt by them. It isn't
Mhm.
fair.
Mhm.
It isn't fair at all. And then you're told to basically suck it up and deal with it. You can't do that.
No.
You can't do that. And I learned that the hard way. And when I first went to therapy about it, that was one of the first things my therapist said. You have to accept what
Mhm.
happened to you. When you do, that's when your healing begins. Acceptance. And
Mhm.
it took me a long time to accept that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. One of the things that it has stuck in for years now with my mom, and society, things that she did say that she opened up about was like how, um, how young women are so labeled because they become hypersexualized over the
Yep.
trauma that they've endured. And yet they learn this hypersexualization from this family member who did this to them at a younger age. And they don't know how else to deal with it, explore it, find their identity. And then society wants to turn around and label that girl a slut.
Right. Because here's the deal with hypersexualization. With women of color, that label is already placed on them.
Mhm.
Already beginning with slavery, slave trading, breeding farms. So the label of hypersexualized or the hypersexualized labels were already there. But then you add to classism. You add working class, middle class, upper echelon. And then this is where you start even seeing more of these labels. So if you're a working class girl, or if you're a poor girl working on a farm, and you are exposed to somebody who turns you out,
Mhm.
all of a sudden you're hypersexualized. Do you know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
I can remember reading about in Louisiana, they used to actually have what's called these quadroon balls. And what quadroon balls were, they were for white farmers
Mhm.
who weren't rich enough to get a girl from high society. So you look for a mixed girl who was close enough.
Mm.
So quadroon meaning you're a third black.
Okay.
Octoroon meaning you're an eighth black. And then there was another one. I forgot what that label was called, but when you were biracial, they had a name for that. And they had these different balls where these men could go and meet these women and marry them. Isn't that crazy?
That's some bullshit.
I'm like, wow, because they couldn't get a Caucasian girl from high society, so I'm going to find one that's close enough. So here you are being tolerated, but not celebrated. But we're going to act like we're going to celebrate you by throwing a ball. I read about this from the daughter of a literary author. His name was Anastasio Poole, and he was a literary critic for the New York Post. And when you look at him, he looks like the guy who owned Studio 54, right?
Oh, okay, right.
But she did some family digging and discovered that he was Black.
Oh.
That his mother, or she traced the ancestry to a great-great-grandmother who was quadroon, who met their great-great-grandfather at one of these balls. And produced, a biracial children. And the grandfather, whose name was Paul Broyard, was this literary critic's father.
Mm-hmm.
And they hid the Black part very well. In fact, there was animosity because he chose to pass as white and his siblings chose to go as Black. So again, inferiority and sex and control produced a whole dichotomy of guilt and dysfunction. And this poor daughter is like researching all this stuff and was like, what? Dad never told me this. Interesting book. When I find it, I'm going to have to put it on our website of interesting reads.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Because that does sound.
That blew me away. I was like, whoa, I used to read his criticisms on certain books and everybody thought he was so conservative, but now I see why. It was like, wow.
No, but I know that with my mom, that made a big impression, like on my daughter, because at one point Ashley cried to her about, Josh called her a slut all the time.
Yeah.
And my mother was like, like I said, it stuck with me. She looked at Ashley and goes, honey, if the word slut was a death sentence for the women in our family, we all would have been burned at the stake centuries ago. My mom.
Oh my God.
But when I think back at it, she was referencing all of this trauma that went back for all the women in our family and how we chose to deal with it all these years,
Wow.
Trying to find ourselves and losing ourselves and multiple men and multiple marriages and
oh yeah. And that brings me to a very interesting question. Do you feel like you're still trying to find yourself through all the muck and the mire of sexual trauma and violence?
Parts of me, yeah.
Yeah,
it took losing my daughter 11 years ago to really find myself. I mean, I had started that journey some, but like to really reflect inward on and be able to focus on me, take time for me, to be comfortable to like take myself to dinner and figure out exactly what I like and and what I wanted to do and the movies I want to see and who I want to be and what I want to leave as a legacy for granddaughters that started coming into my life. I'm still challenged with parts of trying to figure out certain parts of me and where it stems. And some of it's just reflecting back on, like, you know, who am I because of my father, because I don't have that much information. I have some. And even though I found him towards it, you know, final years of my life, he died young and he was so far away. And so I still deal with parts of that. And I still deal with parts of, like, who am I as a child of God?
Yes.
You know?
Yes. Yes. Because I know when my mother disappeared, a lot of me went with her because we were so intertwined. And after recently learning some information that may have perpetuated her disappearance, dealing with a man who was a drug dealer, who was also into prostitution and possible drug trafficking, that learning those circumstances is what made me revisit me and say, okay, it's time to talk now.
Right.
Because for a long time, I would not talk.
No.
It reminded me of Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, that when she was raped at the age of 5, she didn't speak for 3 years.
Right.
And I was very silent about my mother, about my own experience. So when she disappeared, that just took everything out of me. When I escaped my ex-fiance, learning the abuse that my mother went through was very similar to mine. That's what made me revisit that journey again. And that's the journey that I've been on since even learning more information just about what happened or what led up to her disappearance. And that's why I say, okay, it's time to really break my silence and start talking. And so I encourage survivors, women survivors, male survivors, when you find that crossroad of, okay, there's some similarities here,
Right.
definitely start looking at resources on how to help you find your voice so that you could talk again.
Right.
Therapy, definitely. There are organizations such as RAIN. There's Incest Survivors Anonymous. There are many support groups. Celebrate Recovery is another good one. Many support groups that are in your local area that will help you find your way.
Right.
And I encourage everybody to explore those resources because you cannot continue to carry this weight that wasn't yours to carry to begin with. It was put on you.
That part right there.
Yeah. Like the song goes, get that dirt off your shoulder.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think too, I'd like to encourage everybody for final thought from me is to have the conversations with your children and their grandchildren. And a lot of people I know, they think you don't want to involve your children like when you're wrapped up in the trauma, get them wrapped up into the trauma too. But if your children or grandchildren, I mean, Lainey Blake today overheard me talking with her mama about my ex who abused me. And Lainey heard something and we didn't realize, I thought she's across the house and she come back in. She goes, you mean he did what? Well, she heard it and she asked the question. So we had to sit down and have the conversation. And if they're old enough to ask the question, then sit down and have those conversations with them.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Don't deny them those things, because better she hears this now at 9 years old from me and her mother, the trauma that we endured in a calm fashion of this is what happened and this is why it's important. This never happens to you. Even in her 9-year-old brain, I feel will make an impression. It will change something with her instead of her being wrapped up all in our trauma. She sees, these children see, they see what we've endured. They know there's something there. They feel the effects of it. Why wait until they're nearly damn near 40 like I was before I found out what my mother endured before I could understand her?
Exactly. And also by having those conversations in that moment, you're creating a safe space and you're letting them know it's okay to ask.
Yes.
Because we're in a safe place and we're in a safe space to talk about it.
Absolutely.
So don't hold back on your questions. Let's sit down and have a talk. We're in a safe place to do that. Because that's what children really want. They want to feel safe and they want to be heard.
Absolutely.
And if you are not able to do that, then that family therapy is great for that.
Right. Absolutely. That's definitely the place for it.
Absolutely. And I encourage everyone to look into those resources, and we could even place those resources on our website for you.
Yes, we have a resources page on the website. That's breakthecycledv.org. Check out our website. And we also have a support line so that you can talk to somebody. So check out our support
line. Look up
line.
Those resources for you if we don't know them off the top of our head. Absolutely.
Yes. So we encourage everybody to definitely check those out and look for our events. And if you can help support survivors, please donate. So just go to the website, check out our Facebook page, Break the Silence Against Domestic Violence. We got Instagram as well. We're on all the platforms. And of course, our YouTube channel here where we do our podcast. We have great information that can help you. So, and we thank you, Midori, for having this conversation with me. And
yes, it's a much needed conversation. And, we need to explore stuff like this more.
Absolutely. So thank you for attending the podcast.